Hi everyone, this is Grace, and today I'll be walking you through how I made this Sweethearts set. So let's go. This is my latest and greatest online decorating class. If you haven't checked it out, go check out the description. There should be a link in there. There might even be a link in the comments. Link it up, thegracefulbakershop.com. This is what I call an advanced beginner / intermediate. I do have a beginner hearts Valentine's Day class. Also go check that out. So what's the difference between my beginner classes and my more advanced classes? And at this point, I basically just do beginner and then sometimes purely advanced beginner or advanced beginner / intermediate. I just feel like that's where my audience is at. Those are the kinds of classes the majority of the people are looking for. So one of the first big differences is consistency. In a beginner class, I do one consistency, my thick flood. In the more advanced classes like this one, we are doing a 2 consistency outline and flood, which means we are outlining with a piping consistency, in this case my soft peak, and then flooding with a thinner flood, in this case my thin flood. So I do the 2 consistencies for the more advanced classes because you can do so much more detail with the more advanced classes. So right here, this is a decent amount of wet on wet, which I mean, you could do with one consistency, but all of this, what's this called? Scribe work that I'm doing right now takes time because you have to clean off your scribe after every pull. These little lips here are just to die for. I did not come up with this technique at all. Not the first person. But I just do love it. You can just make a simple dot suddenly into these adorable lips. Who doesn't love that? So what else? With the scribe work here, so the first thing you're doing is you're pulling through the top center up until the center of the dot. You don't want to pull further than the center. And then you're pulling from like the outer edge out. And as far as you pull is as far as the lip will go, essentially, right? As far as you pull that color is as far as you'll see. Now I'm using a really thin scribe here, which I do recommend if you have it. It's the PME scribe. I get it on Amazon. Just be warned, there are 2 different PME scribes that the naked eye look exactly the same. But one I think is actually labeled thicker. This is the thinner one. It's not labeled thinner, but anywho, go check out the cookie decorating supplies page on my blog, thegracefulbaker.com, and I link all the scribes that I use there. I have 3 scribes that I always use. Anywho, so the thicker the scribe, the more icing it's going to agitate as it goes through the icing, right? So it's just going to make like a bigger deal out of the lips, if that makes any sense. The dots here, so one of the themes of this set, we've got wet on wet, a few different wet on wet things, and then we've got 3 different borders that I like to show you. So this is one of the borders, just these big fat dots. The key here is to use a soft peak piping consistency, and then instead of pulling straight up, if you watch my hand, I'm doing actually a little flick of the wrist right before I release the icing, so that I'm kind of leaving the icing on top instead of, because if you lift it straight up, you are more likely to get a peak. Now here on these tiny little dots, I'm lifting straight up, but my icing was like a tiny bit thinner for this, for this color, so it worked. I didn't have terrible peaks on all of my dots. Now with those bigger dots especially, you could take a scribe and you could go and settle every single one of those dots, but y'all know me, I've got a lot of patience, but I don't have that much patience. So I gotta draw the line somewhere. But I know other cookiers who would settle every single dot and make it look perfect. And if that's you, that's great. It's just not me. So this is the first one. I just call this the lips. I think she's precious. Next up, I believe, is the chocolate box. So I have a very adamant approach with designing sets where I always believe you need to have at least one really simple design, both for visual variety, but also for execution, right? Because if you're spending your entire set of 24 cookies, whatever it is, making really complicated designs, it's going to take you forever. But if you have at least 1, maybe 2 designs that are really simple that you can just crank out really easily, then it's just going to balance everything out better, right? Like, this is time consuming enough. Give yourself a break. So that's what this cookie is for me. I call this the chocolate box. You'll see in a minute why. This color here is burgundy. It's from the Sugar Art Gel collection. I rarely ever use a color straight out of the bottle, but this is one of those that I will use straight out of the bottle. It's just perfection in my not so humble opinion. In order to get the color this dark, you do need to let the icing color develop, which means over time, the icing will get darker and darker. So with a color this saturated, even with the Sugar Art gels are highly concentrated, so you don't need as much as a traditional gel, but you still need a good amount. So I'll start a color like this at least 24 hours in advance, if not 48. And what I'll do is I'll have the amount of icing I need set aside, and I will color it to maybe like 5 shades lighter than I ultimately need if it's 2 days before. Maybe more than 5 shades. I don't know. Because the general rule of thumb that I always tell people is that if your color is exactly what you want in the bowl, you've gone too far, which just means that if you like, black is easy. If it's jet black in the bowl, it's too much food coloring because it's just going to get darker and darker and darker as you bag the icing, as you decorate, as it dries. So with black, I always recommend a very, very dark gray in the bowl. Just say a prayer and hope that it darkens enough. At the same time, I'm always like, you know what? I think it's way better to have a very dark gray instead of an oversaturated black, because it's going to ruin the flavor. It's going to ruin the texture. It's not going to dry correctly. So that's just my personal opinion. Same rule of thumb, I would say, for a really rich color like this burgundy. Now, this next one is another example of a border option. So like I said, there are 3 different border options in this set. This one, we're going to be rocking a pressure piped beaded border. And to balance that out, I wanted to have a pretty simple, easy to execute center, which is what we've got here. And what we're ultimately going to be doing is the leopard print. If you've been around a minute, you know how much I love leopard and how many different cookies and shapes and sets I put leopard in. And it's just because it's so versatile. It can be used with any color combination, and it's a lot easier to do well than polka dots. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but the simpler the design, the harder it is to do well. And polka dots require a very rounded tip, which can be hard to do. So the beauty here of this leopard is you just do blobs, and then you outline the blobs. And you fill in any kind of empty spaces. Sometimes I outline the blobs twice, as you can see, and sometimes I do just one line. It just depends. I like to add variety. This is also a nice play off of the Beginner Hearts leopard. I think a couple of these designs, or at least this one, a couple of these designs kind of take the design aesthetic from the beginner version and elevate it. So here, the way we're elevating it is we're adding this really complicated border to it. So this is called a pressure piped beaded border. I learned this from the OG Amber of Sweet Ams, like more than 10 years ago. And the key to success here, number 1, is to have the right consistency. You need a thicker consistency. I use my medium peak. Sometimes you can get away with a soft peak, but if your soft peak is on the softer end, it's not going to work. If it's on the thicker end, it'll work. Here, we're rocking a medium peak. Do not do a stiff peak. You will kill your hand. Speaking of killing your hand, the other thing is that you want to cut the tip of your bag big. Like, this is a lot bigger than just outlining width, if that makes sense. So cut it pretty big so that you don't have to apply that much pressure to the bag. You will thank me later. And what you're doing is you're essentially piping a dot and then you're pulling away and you're pulling simultaneously pulling towards the cookie and releasing pressure. So it's a lot of things to do all at once, but it's essentially, it's a teardrop, and you're just layering one teardrop after another. So you're piping a dot, pulling away, pulling toward the cookie, and releasing pressure all at the same time. It's a lot to juggle, and you want to make sure that you're really making the dots tight. So you have a nice, tight, beaded border here. And there we go. Isn't she gorgeous? Now, moving on to the next cookie in this set. Let's see, is this, I think this is the Waves. Yes, it's the Waves cookie. Okay. Sometimes I don't always know right away. All right, so the inspiration for this set actually came from the Heart Shape series set that I did for Valentine's Day in 2021. It's one of my most popular viewed videos on my page, so if you want to go check out that set. I took inspiration from some of the designs. I also obviously took inspiration from the color palette. The difference here with my color palette is I wanted to simplify it a bit. So the one in the Shape series set had 4 colors, I believe, 3 shades of burgundy plus white. For this one, we're just rocking 3 shades of burgundy. In the class workbook description, I highly encourage y'all to do any color you want. It's just 3 different gradations of the same color. It is a bit easier to do 3 different gradations if you're just using a color straight out of the bottle, but if you are hand mixing your color, I do give advice in the workbook about how to handle that with a gradation, so you're not like hand mixing each gradation, if that makes sense. It's a whole thing. You just like make a master batch and then take from that. But anywho, so this one here is a design that I feel like a lot of people have used ever since. And all it is just a gradation of colors, or it doesn't have to be gradation, just like any sets of colors. You're doing a wet on wet next to each other. This is actually surprisingly hard to do, believe it or not. When I'm flooding in sections, like a wet section next to a dry section, I will flood up next to that, but you'll see here, and I'll show you again with the next color, that I'm actually laying an outline down before I flood next to it, and that outline I'm actually laying on the very edge of the previous color. So let's watch this here. You can even see at some point like the medium burgundy kind of peeking through. This is to get the best seamless line. Some people like to flood first and then add that line. Personal preference. This is just what works for me. This is how you're going to get a beautiful clean line. And like, look, I've gotten better at this, so I'm pretty proud of my seams here. I actually came up with this design though as a way to mask your seams, because it's really hard to do this wet on wet look here. So this, we're just going to add some outline or some lines on top of the seams, which y'all, these can cover so much nonsense. Obviously though, you have to like get it perfectly lined up. So I guess if your lines aren't perfectly lined up, then well, then that doesn't work so well. But my original design, I did just 2 lines. And then for this one, we're just going to take it up a notch and do 3 lines, because why not? I like to take the color from the previous section and have that overlap. I don't know. I think it just looks really cool, especially with a gradation of colors, because they're kind of more melting into each other. And then to really take this up a notch, I like to chop off the ends of my lines. Usually I can finish a line better than I can start it. I don't know if this is like the right thing to do, but I really like there to be kind of a seamless waterfall effect off the side of the cookie. And I find that chopping off the end of the line is the best way to do it. If you don't need to, good for you, but this is what I like to do. Now, you have to do it when the icing is freshly wet. If it has started to crust at all, don't even try, because you're going to crumble the end of the line and it's just like not going to look good. But you can see the darker red on the left It's more seamless than the medium red or medium burgundy that's here. And you can see I only chop off one side. So that's the waves cookie. This one, okay, so this is the third border option. This is brush embroidery. Yet again, another technique that I learned from the OG Sweet Ams over 10 years ago. This is one of the first things I learned. I really think that everyone is better off knowing brush embroidery. It's a great technique. It can be used for borders here, but another really common use is brush embroidery flowers. Years ago, I did cookies for my mom's birthday, and I did hydrangeas. And I did a wet on wet technique with that. Mom loves hydrangeas. I don't know if I have that cookie on my YouTube because that's how old those cookies are. I did do a video, but it was like at the very beginning of my video career. But anywho, let's talk about the brush embroidery. A few things to keep in mind. Numero uno, consistency. Again, we're rocking the medium peak here. This is where putting these sets together takes a lot of forethought, or at least I think it does, because the only color, or I didn't want to have to use multiple colors in a medium peak. So that's why this border and the beaded border are the same color, because they're both a medium peak. You need the medium peak, again, for a thicker consistency so that you can actually see the brush strokes. If it's too thin, they're going to immediately melt. And then what was the point of doing brush embroidery? Speaking of, the point here is you're creating this like faded transparent lace effect. So consistency, number one. Number two, I always pipe a bit of a bigger border than, like, this isn't just like a normal piping thickness, if that makes sense. Like, I'm squeezing the bag. I'm actually pressure piping that border, because I find if there's not enough icing to pull from, then you can't pull the icing down far enough, and it just, or you might end up like pulling too far into the border, because what you want to do here, if you can tell, is I'm actually like pulling about halfway into the border. If you pull too far in, you're going to mess with the integrity of that border, which is no bueno. And if you don't pull far enough, you're not going to be pulling enough icing down to create that effect. Ideally, you want to pull enough icing so that it is like covering the area of that scallop. The brush I'm using here is an angled brush. This is my personal preference. A lot of people use like a smaller flat brush, like an 1/8 of an inch or like a 1/16 of an inch, pretty small. I will use that if I'm doing a much larger area, but for something like this where the scallops are so small, I prefer this angled brush. Now, does it take you longer? Probably yes, because if you're using a bigger brush, yeah, you can cover more area faster, but I don't know. I like the look of the angled brush. So that's me. And I forgot. So you also want to have a damp brush, not wet. Off camera, every time I take the brush away, oh my God, what is it called? I dip it in a bowl of water and I pat it on a paper towel. So if it's too wet, you'll know right away, because it'll just melt the icing, and you won't have that definition you're looking for. So you want to let that dry for, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes, and then go in with your outline here. Doing this outline can be a little hairy because you ideally want to lay it on top of the very edge of that lace, the brush embroidery, but it might be a little lumpy depending on how much icing you used. So just keep that in mind. Sometimes the border ends up looking a little wonky, but whatever, or the outline, I should say, not the border. I didn't let that outline dry because #no patience, but you might want to let it dry. That said, if it is a little wonky kind of sitting on top of the edge of that lace, if you immediately flood and you have a wet outline, then what I'm doing here, it allows me to kind of finesse the outline if I don't like it that much, but that's kind of like a next level thing. Okay, this here is another like take it up a notch version of the beginner hearts. So we're doing this classic wet on wet scribe pull where it creates these adorable little hearts out of these dots, but we're taking it up a notch because we're doing a lot more dots and we're adding a second layer of dots, ideally a little bit smaller than the first ones. I chose to do this as the design in the center because that border takes a long time. And like I'm always talking about, you want to have balance in your designs. So I was thinking about doing something a lot more complicated. I was going to do this knit effect. I'm losing my brain on the word right now. That would have taken so much longer. And I wanted to balance out the design here. A really complicated border, a much simpler center. So people are calling this like the heart wreath. Super cute. Love that. Okay, this next one is another one of the simpler designs. We're just going to be outlining and flooding this. And then it's going to get covered with pressure piped dots, which I can't remember in class if we do, not pressure piped dots, pressure piped hearts. I'm not sure if we do these hearts first or the border first. It's a great question, Grace. I don't know. I think we probably do the border first, but anywho, it is taking the same concept, the same basic concept of a pressure piped teardrop and applying it in a different way. So you'll see that in a minute. In terms of this outline and flood here, I don't know what to say. This is my soft peak piping consistency and my thin flood. The heart that I use for this set is the Charming Heart, I believe, from Brighton Cutters. I love this heart. I love chubby things. I love chubby hearts. In my opinion, it's like a slightly more elevated heart. The beginner heart the heart that I chose for the beginner hearts class is a much more classic heart with like the more pointed bottom. Use whatever your heart desires, pun intended. If you already have a different heart on hand, it really doesn't matter what you use. I just like variety. So you want to allow that base to dry probably for at least an hour. Like you want to be able to run your finger across the top and it's mostly smooth. You might even be able to apply a tiny bit of pressure and not have it cave in. Because if you're not careful piping these hearts, you could definitely puncture the icing. So maybe even 2 hours. I don't know, but I would say at least an hour. So you can see here, it's just like the pressure piped teardrop, but in a V shape. So pipe a dot, pull away towards the cookie and release pressure at the same time, create that teardrop. I like the monochromatic look with this. Again, I'm all about like visual variety, and there are a lot of cookies in the set with a lot of different colors. So I wanted to make sure that there was a cookie fully in each color. So that's where the chocolate box is the dark burgundy. The one you just saw, the hearts, is the light burgundy. And then this one is the medium burgundy. So I called this the puffer vest, I think. And then someone, when I shared this, was like, Grace, quilted heart. That's a much better name. And I was like, oh my God, that is a much better name. Quilted heart. I really struggle coming up with names for these brain fart, another brain fart, for these one shape sets. But that's okay. So by the way, this is an edible marker that I'm using. I like Food Doodler. I get them on Amazon. It is very normal for edible markers when you're drawing directly on cookies for them to kind of die pretty quickly, and that's because of all the butter from the cookies. The fat just kind of ruins the marker eventually, but I find that this brand just works the best for me, and it has a nice like small but sturdy tip to it. So that's my personal preference. This is another design that was taken from my heart shape series, but I simplified this one a bit. My heart shape series one had a few more of these quilted sections. And the more there are, just like the harder it is to do. Okay, so we're doing flooding in sections here. This is like the ultimate application of flooding in sections, where you flood alternate sections, let them crust over, and then flood the remaining ones. And that gives you that gives you separation in between sections. So I do the squiggle technique here to help prevent craters. Is it foolproof? No, but I do think it helps. I think your consistency has more to do with craters than anything when you're doing a first layer of icing like this. When you're doing icing as a second layer and you're worried about craters, that's a whole different ballgame. But the thicker the icing, the less likely it is to crater. If your icing is really thin, it's going to be much more likely to crater. So this is a thinner icing, and I kind of said a prayer with this one. I also use a dehydrator when I decorate, which something like this, I will immediately pop it in the dehydrator for 10 to 15 minutes in between to help set that icing faster. What else can I say? Oh, here, one of the keys to the success is making sure that you are using that scribe to get the icing into all the little corners. So you can't do that with the tip of your icing bag, but you definitely can with your scribe. This is one of those techniques that like I learned pretty early on how to flood in sections, but it took me a long time to get really good at it. And when I think of what makes good flooding in sections, I think it's two main things. Having it nice and puffy, no craters, and then having beautiful, like seamless connection and a really, I guess it's three things, seamless connection between all the sections and a really beautiful, smooth seam as well. So you're going to see in a second. Okay, so we let those crust over. Now I'm going to do the little squiggle. I don't let my squiggle dry. The whole idea is it's supposed to kind of hold up the icing a little bit better. And I do think it works best when it's still wet. Okay, so unlike the waves where we're doing wet next to wet, you see, this is what I mean. I like to flood right up next to my dry section. In the ideal world, you get it on the first try, you get that seam, and you don't have to go over it again. So let's watch this magic here. This is one of the keys to success, I think, with a really smooth seam. If you're flooding your area and you're not used to flooding all the way to the edge, you're used to like using your scribe to always encourage the icing into the edge. I find that the more you have to mess with the seam with your scribe, the messier the seam ends up looking. So obviously with these corners here, you have to use the scribe to get them into the corners, but as much as possible, I like to make first contact with the icing with these seams. I don't know if this is making any sense, but hopefully it is. If you are going to use your scribe to encourage your icing to touch the seams, just don't get your scribe all the way up to the dried section. I would say leave like a couple of millimeters in between. As you're working on this, you're going to see what I mean. If you get too close to the seam with your scribe, it's going to make this uneven, lumpy looking seam. So hopefully these tips and tricks make some degree of sense. Et voila. And I believe we're going to be totally done in just a moment. If I would just stop messing with this with my scribe. I only use a scribe like this when it really makes a difference. And y'all, it really makes a difference. And there we go. That's the puffer vest or the quilted heart. And that is it, my friends. That is all 7 designs. 7. Can I count? Yeah. Wow. In my Sweethearts class. As always, I hope you enjoyed listening to this. I hope you learned a thing or two. I hope you take the class. Go check out the gracefulbakershop.com to purchase this class. Okay, that's it. Thanks for listening, and I hope y'all have a sweet one. Bye.